They say the sea keeps its secrets, but sometimes the dead speak louder than the living. In the autumn of 1994, humanity launched a floating city into the dark waters of the Baltic. It was a white fortress of steel, a symbol of freedom and a bridge between two worlds. It was designed to be unsinkable not by magic, but by the sheer force of modern engineering. But the ocean does not negotiate with engineers. What happened on that cold September night was not just a disaster, it was a reckoning. It wasn't caused by an iceberg or a torpedo. It was caused by the one thing we never check when we board a ship, our own confidence. It is a story of a grand ambition that met a brutal reality, where the drive for profit collided with the absolute laws of physics. Tonight we are going to look past the headlines and the official reports. We are going to descend into the heart of the machine to understand how a vessel certified as safe became a tomb for 852 souls in less than an hour. So, turn off the lights, settle in. Join me as we peel back the layers of history to uncover the story of the MS Estonia and find out why the door that was designed to open ultimately refused to close. The water of the Baltic Sea is not like the water of the ocean. It is younger, fresher, and darker. It sits in a basin of ancient rock, shallow and temperamental, a grey mirror that reflects the sky of northern Europe. For centuries, sailors have learned that this sea does not behave with the rhythmic, rolling predictability of the Atlantic. The waves here are short, they are steep, they hit with the violence of a hammer rather than the push of a swell. And in the autumn of 1994, the Baltic was waiting. If you stood on the quayside in Tallinn on the evening of September 27th, you would not have felt fear. You would have felt the cold, certainly. The wind was picking up, tugging at the collars of coats and rattling the loose chains of the harbour fences. But you would not have felt danger. You would have felt the heavy industrial comfort of routine. Before you stood the MS Estonia. She was a giant, a white fortress of steel rising 9 decks above the black water. To the people of Estonia, and to the travellers moving between the fragile new democracies of the East and the wealthy stability of the West, she was more than a ship. She was a bridge. She was a symbol of freedom, a floating piece of territory that promised speed, luxury, and connection. On this specific Tuesday night, the scene was entirely ordinary. It is important to understand this ordinariness. Disasters of this magnitude, the ones that become etched into the collective memory of a continent, rarely announce themselves with thunderclaps at the start. They begin with the mundane sound of tires on metal. Trucks were rolling onto the car deck, Volvo FH12s, Scanias, heavily laden with goods, their diesel engines idling with a low, guttural thrum that vibrated through the hull. Families were walking up the gangways, carrying duty-free bags and luggage. There were students returning to universities in Sweden. There were businessmen closing deals that would have been impossible just 5 years prior, before the Iron Curtain fell. There were elderly couples looking forward to the buffet, the dance band, and a comfortable cabin. They were entering a machine designed to make them forget the sea. Once inside, the roar of the wind vanished, replaced by the soft hum of ventilation systems and the clinking of cutlery in the restaurants. The interior was designed to look like a hotel, not a vessel. Carpets, brass railings, mirrors, and bright lights. It was a bubble of warmth and civilization. But outside, the barometer was falling. The meteorological reports were already circulating on the bridge, printed on thin thermal paper, noting a deepening low-pressure system moving in from the Atlantic. The wind was expected to rise to storm force. To the crew, seasoned men who had spent their lives on these grey waters, this was not a warning to stop. It was simply a change in the variables. It was autumn in the Baltic. The schedules were tight, the ship was large, and the sea was simply the road they travelled on. To understand why 852 people would not see the sunrise, we cannot just look at the storm. We have to look at the ambition that built the ship. We have to look back at the era that birthed her. The MS Estonia was not a unique anomaly. She was a child of the ferry boom, a specific industrial phenomenon of the late 1970s and 80s. This was the era of the cruise ferry. Before this time, ferries were utilitarian things, grim, functional transports designed to move a car from point A to point B. But as the economies of Northern Europe swelled, the operators realized something profound. They were not just selling transportation, They were selling an experience, and they were selling time. The design philosophy shifted. The ships grew wider, taller, and heavier. They became floating cities. They needed to hold hundreds of cars and dozens of trucks to be profitable, but they also needed to hold restaurants, casinos, saunas, and swimming pools to be desirable. This created a distinct engineering challenge. To make a ship profitable, you need to load and unload it quickly. Time spent in port is money lost. In the old days, cars might have been craned on or driven through side doors. But the demand for speed created the concept of the ro-ro, roll-on, roll-off. It is exactly what it sounds like. A ship that opens at both ends, effectively turning the vessel into a section of the highway. You drive in the back, park, cross the sea, and drive out the front. It was brilliant. It was efficient. It revolutionized trade. But it required a structural compromise that would haunt the industry. To drive out the front, the ship needs a hole in its bow, a massive opening, barely a few meters above the waterline, right where the ship takes the hardest beating from the waves. The engineers knew this, of course. They were not blind. They designed complex mechanisms to seal this hole. But the philosophy had shifted. The ship was no longer a sealed capsule fighting the ocean. It was a warehouse that needed to be temporarily watertight. The marketing brochures promised the Blue Highway. They sold the idea that the sea had been tamed, that it was merely a gap in the pavement to be bridged by these white giants. They sold the illusion that the environment outside the hull did not matter. This illusion was maintained by the sheer size of the vessels. When you stand next to a ferry like the Estonia, looking up at the towering white steel, it feels like a building. It feels terrestrial. It implies a permanence and stability that the ocean does not respect. The passengers boarding that night in Tallinn saw the size, and they felt safe. They did not know that stability at sea is a complex equation of gravity, buoyancy, and free surface effect. They did not know that a ship this large relies on the integrity of a few crucial seals to remain upright. The most critical of these seals was the bow visor. If you visualize the front of the MS Estonia, it did not look like the sharp prow of a warship or the flat nose of a barge. It was streamlined, bulbous, designed to push water aside efficiently, but the entire nose of the ship was actually a moving part. This was the visor. Think of the helmet of a medieval knight. To see the face inside, you lift the visor up. That is exactly how the ship opened. A 55-ton mass of steel hinged at the top, driven by powerful hydraulic arms. When the ship was in port, the visor would hydraulically lift, pointing toward the sky, revealing the loading ramp folded up behind it like a drawbridge. When the loading was done, the ramp would be raised and locked, and then the massive visor would be lowered over it, clamped shut with heavy steel bolts. It was a double door. The ramp was the first defense. The visor was the outer shield. In theory, it was a sound design. It had been used on hundreds of ships. It was approved by classification societies, the organizations responsible for certifying that a ship is fit to sail. But there was a subtle flaw in the thinking. A flaw that would only become apparent when the variables were pushed to their limit. The visor was designed to protect the ramp from the waves, but it was also a giant scoop. If the waves were high enough and the ship was moving fast enough, the water wouldn't just slide around the bow, it would slam into it. It would lift it. The forces involved in a head-on collision between a 55-ton piece of steel and a braking wave are astronomical. Hundreds of tons of pressure, repeated every few seconds, for hours on end. The engineers debated the efficiency of the latching mechanisms. They calculated the sheer strength of the bolts, but the calculations were based on normal operating conditions. They assumed that if the weather got too bad, the captain would slow down. They assumed that the ship would turn away from the waves. They assumed a dialogue between the machine and the elements. But the machine was built for a schedule, and the schedule demanded speed. There is a concept in safety engineering called normalization of deviance. It means that if you take a risk and get away with it, you stop seeing it as a risk. You start seeing it as normal. If you drive without a seatbelt and don't crash, you eventually stop thinking about the seatbelt. The ferry industry in the Baltic had been driving without a seatbelt for years. Before that night in 1994, there had been warnings. They were quiet warnings, buried in logbooks and maintenance reports, written in the dry technical language of maritime bureaucracy. One specific incident stands out, haunting the narrative like a ghost that was ignored. A year before the Estonia disaster, a sister ship, the Diana II, had encountered a storm in the same waters. The storm was fierce, the waves punishing. The crew of the Diana II heard strange noises from the bow, bangs, metallic groans. When they arrived in port and inspected the damage, they found that the bow visor, the same design as the Estonia's, had been partially torn loose. The locking bolts were bent and cracked. The steel had fatigued. The visor had been flapping in the storm, held on by luck and gravity. It was a near-miss catastrophe. If the storm had lasted another hour, the Diana II might have lost her visor. If she had lost her visor, water would have reached the car deck. But she didn't sink. She made it to port. The damage was repaired. A report was filed. And this is where the tragedy begins to take shape, not in the metal but in the paperwork. The incident was viewed as a maintenance issue, not a design flaw. The wording in the reports was softened. It was a wear and tear problem. It was an anomaly. There was no fleet-wide recall. There was no urgent telex sent to all captains of ro-ro ferries, warning them to check their visor locks. The information was siloed. It was filed away in cabinets in offices in Finland and Germany. The risk was invisible because the failure hadn't happened yet. The industry looked at the Diana II and saw a success. The ship had survived. They should have seen a warning. The design was reaching its limit. So the Estonia kept sailing. Her crew knew she was a strong ship. They trusted the German engineering that had built her. They looked at the massive steel bolts of the visor and saw permanence. They did not see metal that was slowly becoming brittle, microscopic cracks forming in the welds, tired from thousands of cycles of opening and closing, opening and closing. And then there was the name. Estonia. We must not underestimate the pressure of identity. In 1994, the nation of Estonia had only recently regained its independence from the Soviet Union. The grey Soviet veil had been lifted, and the country was hungry to rejoin the world. The ship was the flagship of the young republic. She was purchased and repainted with the national colours, blue, black, and white. She was staffed by an Estonian crew who were immensely proud of her. To work on the Estonia was prestigious. It meant you were part of the new era. It meant you were Western-facing. But with this pride came a heavy burden. The ship had to be reliable. It had to be on time. It had to prove that an Estonian-run company could operate just as efficiently as the Swedish or Finnish lines. There was a subconscious, pervasive pressure to not show weakness, to not be the one who cancels the crossing because of a little wind, to not be the one who delays the arrival in Stockholm, causing the trucks to miss their deliveries. This psychological landscape is the unseen cargo of the ship. It is why the captain, Arvo Andresson, stood on the bridge that night with a rigid determination. He was a capable seaman, respected and stern. But he was also a man of his time and place. He was driving the symbol of his nation, and symbols do not hide in port when the schedule says, "Depart." The weather briefing arrived at the bridge shortly before departure. The low-pressure system was deepening faster than predicted. The wind speeds were climbing. The forecast used words like gale and storm. In the sterile, well-lit environment of the bridge, surrounded by radar screens and glowing dials, these words were just data. The bridge of a modern ferry is high up, far removed from the water. You cannot feel the waves the same way you do on a smaller vessel. You feel a gentle roll, a vibration. The violence of the sea is dampened by technology. The officers discussed the route. They looked at the stabilizers, fins that extend from the hull to reduce rolling. They looked at the 4 massive diesel engines, capable of pushing the ship at 21 knots. They had the power to punch through the weather. The distinction between challenging and dangerous is often only clear in hindsight. To the crew, this was a challenging night. It would be uncomfortable. The passengers would be seasick. Plates might slide off tables. But it wasn't viewed as dangerous. Dangerous implies a threat to survival. And in the modern maritime world, ships like the Estonia simply did not sink. That was a thing of the past, of the Titanic era, of wooden hulls and lack of radar. This was 1994. We had conquered the ocean with math and steel. The decision was made. The engines were engaged. At 7:15 p.m., the last truck was locked in place on the car deck. The heavy steel ramp was raised, the hydraulic pumps whined, and the massive bow visor lowered slowly, sealing the ship like a tomb. The locking bolts, 3 on the bottom, 2 on the sides, slid into place. The sensors indicated closed. The mooring lines were cast off. The ship drifted away from the quay, the lights of Tallinn twinkling in the gathering dusk. On the car deck it was dark and smelling of oil. The vehicles sat in rows, chained down to the deck plates to prevent them from moving. There was silence there, save for the creaking of the suspension as the ship began to move. Above, in the bars and cabins, the mood was light. The ferry was a duty-free zone. The beer was cheap, the music was playing, people were settling in. They were unwrapping sandwiches, opening books, laughing with friends. They were exploring the floating city. As the Estonia moved past the breakwater and into the open Gulf of Finland, the first waves hit the bow. A shudder ran through the ship, just a small one, a reminder. The spray flew up over the forecastle, hitting the bridge windows. The captain ordered full speed. The schedule had to be kept. Night fell completely. The horizon disappeared, erasing the line between the black sky and the black water. The only light came from the ship itself, a lonely cluster of electricity pushing into the void. The wind began to howl, a high-pitched keen that could be heard even through the thick glass of the passenger decks. The waves grew higher, shifting from chop to rolling mountains of water. The Estonia began to pitch, nose up, nose down. Every time the nose went down, it met the oncoming sea. 55 tons of visor crashed into the water, then was ripped back out as the buoyancy lifted the bow. Smash, lift, smash, lift. Down in the darkness of the bow mechanism, invisible to the sensors on the bridge, the steel of the locking lugs began to feel the strain. The metal, cold and stressed, held its breath. The routine night was over. The grand ambition was about to meet the absolute reality of the North Atlantic, and the passengers, warm in their cabins, safe in their floating hotel, had no idea that the door protecting them from the deep was already beginning to ask questions it could not answer. The ship sailed on, a white speck in a growing fury, heading west into the dark. To understand the death of the MS Estonia, we must first understand her life. We must strip away the white paint, the carpets, and the duty-free perfume, and look at the skeleton of the beast. We must descend from the bridge, down through the 9 decks of cabins and restaurants, down past the waterline, into the humming, greasy heart of the machine. A ship is a city that generates its own power, purifies its own water, and breathes its own air. Deep in the hull, 4 massive diesel engines, Wärtsilä Vasa designs, were turning the shafts. They were the muscles of the creature, thumping with a rhythmic, deafening bass that vibrated through the steel plates. In the control room, men in blue overalls watched dials that monitored temperature, pressure, and revolutions per minute. To them, the storm was a set of numbers, a load on the engines, a fluctuation in fuel consumption. But if you walked forward from the engine room, through the watertight bulkheads, you would enter the most critical space in the entire vessel. The car deck, Deck 2. It is a cavernous space, a long, low tunnel running the entire length of the ship. On this night, it was a parking lot at sea. Rows of trucks were chained to the floor, their suspensions compressed, their heavy canvas sides swaying slightly with the roll of the ship. The air here was different. It was cold. It smelled of diesel exhaust, rubber tires, and salt. It was dark, illuminated only by the harsh industrial glow of strip lighting. This space, this vast open hangar, was the economic reason for the ship's existence. It was what made the money. But in the architecture of naval safety, it was a paradox. For centuries, ships were built like honeycombs. They were divided into small, watertight compartments. If you punched a hole in the hull of a traditional ship, one compartment would flood, but the air in the others would keep the vessel afloat. The Titanic had compartments. They failed, but the concept was sound. But a ro-ro ferry, a roll-on, roll-off ship, cannot be a honeycomb. You cannot park trucks in small rooms. You need a highway. You need a single, massive, uninterrupted open space just above the waterline. This design creates a terrifying binary state. As long as the car deck is dry, the ship is incredibly stable. It is a wide, flat raft. It is safe. But if water enters this space, if the sea finds a way onto the car deck, the rules of physics change instantly. There is a phenomenon known to naval architects as the free surface effect. It is the nightmare scenario. Imagine holding a flat tray of water. If you tilt it just a little, all the water rushes to one side. The weight shifts instantly. The tray tips further. The water rushes harder. It creates a momentum that cannot be stopped. On a ship like the Estonia, a few inches of water on the car deck would weigh hundreds of tons. If the ship rolls to the right, that water slides to the right. It doesn't just sit there, it hits the wall. It acts like a battering ram pushing the ship down, preventing it from rolling back up. The engineers knew this. The architects knew this. The safety of the entire vessel, the lives of nearly 1,000 people, relied on one absolute rule. The car deck must remain dry. The garage door must stay closed, and the door was the bow. Let us look closely at that bow mechanism again. It is midnight now. The storm has reached its peak. The waves are no longer just water, they are kinetic energy, 4 meters high, 5 meters, sometimes 6. They are moving at the speed of a sprinting man. The Estonia is punching into them at full speed. The bow visor, that 55-ton helmet, is taking the blows. Every time the ship dips her nose, the sea slams upward against the bottom of the visor. It is an uppercut, thousands of tons of force lifting the steel mask. Holding this mask down were 3 main locking devices, the Atlantic lock at the bottom and 2 side locks. The Atlantic lock was a thick steel bolt, a pin that slid through a lug to clamp the visor shut. It looked indestructible, a piece of metal as thick as a man's arm. But metal is not dead matter. It has a memory, it gets tired. For 14 years this ship had sailed the Baltic. For 14 years that bolt had been rattled, vibrated, stressed and relaxed. Microscopic changes were happening in the crystal lattice of the steel, and on this night the force was not just rattling it, it was hammering it. The waves were acting as a lever. The visor was a long pry bar. The fulcrum was the hinge at the top of the deck. The lock at the bottom was taking the entire load of the ocean, trying to pry the ship open. Inside the ship, the sound was changing. Around 12:30 a.m., a new noise introduced itself to the symphony of the storm. Passengers in the forward cabins on Deck 1, the lowest passenger deck below the car deck, heard it first. It was not the dull thud of waves. It was a sharp metallic report, like a heavy sledgehammer hitting an anvil. Clang. Then silence, then another. Screech. A scraping sound. Metal against metal. Normally on a ship you hear noises, pipes bang, plates shift. But this was different. It was the sound of structure failing. It was the sound of the ship crying out. On the bridge the officers heard a bang. But the bridge is far away. It is insulated. It is a world of soft lights and calm voices. A seaman was sent down to check. He walked the corridors. He listened. He reported back. Everything looks normal. Here is the tragedy of the design. The seaman checked the car deck ramps. He checked the indicator lights on the bridge console. The lights were green. Green means locked. Green means safe. But the sensors were simple switches. They told the bridge that the bolts were extended. They did not tell the bridge that the steel holding the bolts was ripping apart. The machine was lying to its masters. The officers on the bridge could not see the bow. The design of the Estonia was such that the nose of the ship was hidden from the view of the wheelhouse. They were driving blind, trusting a green light on a dashboard, while the front of their ship was being dismantled by the sea. Down in the darkness, the Atlantic lock gave up. It didn't snap. It tore. The housing that held the bolt was welded to the bulkhead. The welds failed. The entire locking mechanism was ripped out of the steel, leaving a jagged hole. The visor was now loose at the bottom. It was flapping. Every time a wave hit, the 55-ton shield bounced up and down, slamming against the hull. Bang, bang, bang. The passengers on Deck 1 turned up the volume on their radios. They pulled pillows over their heads. They told themselves it was just the storm. We must pause here to consider the psychology of the passenger. This is the normalcy bias. It is a survival mechanism that in this specific instance became a death sentence. When we are in a situation of perceived safety, a sturdy ship, a paid ticket, a warm bed. Our brains refuse to accept data that contradicts that safety. We rationalize the danger away. If something was wrong, the alarm would sound. If we were sinking, the crew would tell us, the ship is too big to break. So, they stayed in their beds. In the pub Admiral on Deck 5, the karaoke had just finished. The entertainer, a man named Jew, had sung his last song. A few die-hard partygoers were still drinking beer, swaying as the floor tilted beneath them. They laughed when glasses slid off the tables. They treated the violence of the ocean as a novelty, a ride at an amusement park. They did not know that a few meters beneath their feet, the battle was already lost. It is now shortly before 1 a.m. The timeline becomes fragmented, measured in seconds rather than minutes. The visor, having ripped free of its bottom lock, was now being held only by the side locks and the top hinges. But the leverage was too great. The waves kept coming. The ocean does not get tired. It does not pause to assess the damage. It just strikes again. The side locks failed next. They sheared off with the sound of a cannon shot. Now, the visor was attached only by the main hinges at the deck level. It was hanging loose, swinging wildly in the gale, and here is the final, fatal geometric twist. The visor was designed to lift up to let cars in. The loading ramp, the actual road surface, was folded up behind it. The top of the ramp sat inside the visor like a letter in an envelope. As the visor was battered up and down by the waves, its bottom edge caught the top of the ramp. The visor became a hook. With the force of the next giant wave, the visor was thrown backward over the nose of the ship. As it tumbled back, it pulled the ramp with it. It forced the ramp open. Imagine a drawbridge being kicked down from the outside. The hydraulic rams holding the ramp fought back, but they were no match for the weight of the falling visor. They bent. They snapped. The ramp crashed down onto the open position. The mouth of the ship was wide open. The Estonia was traveling at 14 knots into a storm, with her front door removed. There was no more barrier. The car deck, that vast open stability paradox, was exposed directly to the Baltic Sea. This was not a leak. This was an ingestion. The water did not trickle in, it surged. Thousands of cubic meters of freezing black water rushed into the tunnel. It hit the first trucks. It swirled around the tires. The free surface effect began instantly. The water sloshed to the starboard side, the right side. The ship felt the weight. She leaned. On the bridge, the officer on watch noticed the list. 1 degree starboard, he might have thought. Then 2, then 3. He adjusted the trim tanks. He tried to steer into the wind to correct it, but you cannot correct physics with a rudder. You cannot balance a scale when one side is being loaded with the ocean. On the car deck, the water was rising fast. It was no longer just a layer on the floor. It was waist deep, then chest deep. The trucks began to shift. The chains holding them snapped like thread. Vehicles weighing tons slid across the wet steel, crashing into the walls, crushing whatever was in their path. The noise was apocalyptic. Screeching metal, shattering glass, the roar of the water. But the passengers on the upper decks heard very little of this. The ship was big. The insulation was thick. What they felt was the angle. At 1:14 a.m. the list increased sharply. It went from a nuisance to a problem. People sleeping in their bunks rolled over. Perfume bottles slid off vanities. In the duty-free shop, the shelves emptied. Bottles of whiskey and vodka crashed to the floor, creating a river of glass and alcohol that mixed with the sea. In the engine room, the monitors flashed red. The engineers saw the water entering the car deck on the CCTV cameras. Imagine that moment. Staring at a grainy black and white screen, seeing the ocean pouring into your ship where there should be dry steel. They knew. In that split second, they knew. They tried to call the bridge. We have water on the car deck, it looks bad. But it was too late for pumps. It was too late for damage control. The math had already decided the outcome. The ship took a sudden violent lurch to starboard. 30 degrees. This is the moment the world turned sideways. If you are standing in a room and the floor tilts 30 degrees, you cannot stand. You fall. The walls become floors. The floors become slides. In the cabins, people were thrown from their beds against the walls. Those who were awake, walking in the corridors, were slammed against the bulkheads. The normalcy bias shattered. The illusion of the hotel vanished. The machine was dying, and it was taking them with it. The lights flickered. The generators were struggling as the oil in their sumps sloshed away from the intake pumps. The engines coughed and died. Silence returned to the machinery, replaced by the screaming of the wind and the screaming of the people. The grand ambition was gone. The reality had taken over. The floating highway was no longer a bridge to Sweden. It was a falling object, surrendering to the gravity of the dark sea below. And the water kept coming, not asking for permission, not checking tickets, just filling the void, seeking its own level, dragging the pride of a nation down into the cold. The disaster had moved from the mechanical to the human. The bolts had failed. Now it was flesh and blood that had to survive. The transition from a ship that is sailing to a ship that is dying is not gradual. It is geometric. At 1:15 a.m. the MS Estonia did not just lean. She transformed. The list settled at 30 degrees to starboard. We must pause and visualize what 30 degrees means. In our daily lives, a steep hill is perhaps 10 degrees. A staircase is 45. 30 degrees is not a floor. It is a slide. It is a surface that rejects you. Inside the ship, the architecture of safety instantly became an architecture of entrapment. The logic of the vessel, hallways, doors, stairwells, was predicated on gravity pulling down toward the keel. But now gravity was pulling sideways. If you were in a cabin on the starboard side, the low side, you were no longer lying in a bed. You were lying against the wall. The door, your only exit, was now on the ceiling. To leave, you had to climb the furniture, reach up, turn the handle, and push a heavy door upward against its own weight. For the elderly, for the children, this was not difficult. It was impossible. They were sealed in their rooms by the simple physics of the angle. If you were on the port side, the high side, the door was on the floor. If you opened it, you were looking down into a dark shaft. The corridor outside was no longer a hallway. It was a pit. This is the moment when the chaos became total. In the public spaces, the illusion of civilization dissolved. In the bars and restaurants, unbolted tables, chairs, cash registers, and slot machines became projectiles. They slid across the room, gathering speed, crashing into the lower walls, crushing anyone who had fallen there. The piano in the Baltic bar broke loose. It thundered across the parquet floor, a half-ton of brass and wood smashing through the glass partitions. The sound was deafening. It was the sound of a city being shaken inside a box, glass shattering, steel groaning, and beneath it all, the terrifying rising roar of water rushing through the lower decks. On the bridge, the situation had moved beyond control. The officers were struggling to stand. They were clinging to the consoles, their feet slipping on the linoleum. The world outside the windows was wrong. On one side, the black waves were splashing against the glass. On the other, the sky. At 1:22 a.m., 7 minutes after the list began, the second mate managed to reach the radio. He sent out the call that still chills the blood of every sailor in the Baltic. "Mayday, Mayday, Estonia, please." The voice was not panicked. It was urgent, but controlled. It was the voice of a man doing his job while the floor fell away beneath him. The reply came from the MS Silja Europa, another massive ferry nearby. "Estonia, Silja Europa. Are you calling Mayday?" "Yes, I am." "What is happening?" "We have a problem, a bad list. I have a blackout. I cannot give you our position." That sentence, "I have a blackout," marked the death of the machine's brain. The main engines had failed. The main generators had tripped offline. The bright, reassuring lights of the ferry died. For a second, there was total darkness. Then, the emergency generator kicked in. It was a smaller engine, located high up in the funnel, designed for exactly this moment. A dim, sickly yellow light flickered on in the corridors. It was not enough to see clearly, but enough to see the terror. The ship was drifting now, powerless, broadside to the waves. The stabilizers were useless. The rudder was dead. The Estonia was no longer fighting the storm. She was surrendering to it. Inside the stairwells, a desperate migration began. Human beings have a primal instinct to go up, to reach the air, to reach the sky. Hundreds of passengers, those who had managed to escape their cabins, were fighting their way toward the upper decks. But the stairwells were designed for walking, not climbing. With the ship listing at 40, then 50 degrees, the stairs became jagged cliffs. The handrails were now overhead, out of reach. The walls were slick with condensation and spilled drinks. People formed human chains. They pulled each other up. Strangers grasped the hands of strangers, hauling them over the lips of the stairs. But for every person who climbed, others slipped. They fell back down into the darkness of the lower landings, piling up against the bulkheads. There were no announcements, no organized evacuation. The public address system was dead or unmanned. The crew, those who were not trapped themselves, were fighting the same gravity as the passengers. The system of authority had collapsed, leaving only the raw will to survive. And then the angle increased again. The water on the car deck was no longer just sloshing. It was filling the space. It was pouring down into the engine room, into the generator room. The ship was settling deeper. At 1:30 a.m. the list reached 60 degrees. You cannot walk on 60 degrees. You can only crawl. Those who made it to the open decks stepped out into a nightmare. The wind was screaming at force 9. The spray was freezing, hitting the skin like buckshot. The ship was lying on her side so severely that the wooden promenade deck was now a wall. The windows of the cabins were the floor. People were walking on the windows. Imagine looking down between your feet and seeing the dark interior of a cabin, a face pressed against the glass from the inside, screaming for help, and then looking up and seeing the lifeboats dangling uselessly. This is the great failure of the lifeboat design. Lifeboats are hung on davits, cranes that lower them into the water, but davits rely on gravity. They are designed to work if the ship is upright or listing slightly. On the high side of the Estonia, the boats were hanging over the hull, suspended in mid-air. They could not be lowered because they would just bang against the side of the ship. On the low side, the boats were already underwater or smashed by the waves. The sophisticated evacuation systems, the rafts, the chutes, they were rendered impotent by the extreme angle. The technology had assumed a polite disaster. It had not prepared for this. So the people were left with nothing but the ship itself. They huddled on the side of the hull. The white steel was freezing. They held onto railings, onto vents, onto each other. They were a cluster of fragile biological heat in a world of cold mechanical indifference. And then the moon came out. It is a detail often mentioned by survivors. For a brief moment, the clouds broke. The moon illuminated the scene with a cold, pale light. It showed the white hull of the ferry rising like a whale from the water. It showed the black mountains of the waves. It showed the debris, life jackets, deck chairs, rafts scattered on the foam. It was a spotlight on the end of the world. At 1:35 a.m., the list reached 90 degrees. The ship was now lying completely on its side. The funnel hit the water. The emergency generator, which had been keeping the dim lights burning, swallowed a mouthful of the Baltic Sea and died. Total darkness returned. Now the only sounds were the wind and the groaning of the ship. The air trapped inside the hull was being forced out. It whistled and screamed through vents and broken windows. It sounded like the ship was exhaling its final breath. For the people clinging to the outside of the hull, this was the moment of decision. The ship was sinking beneath them. The steel they were standing on was disappearing into the water. They had to jump. To jump into the Baltic in September is to jump into a shock. The water was 10 degrees Celsius. It doesn't sound freezing, but water steals heat from the body 25 times faster than air. The moment you hit it, your breath is stolen. Your muscles tighten. Your heart rate spikes. Hundreds jumped. They fell into the churning black chaos. They grasped for anything that floated. Upside-down life rafts, debris, other people. Those who found rafts struggled to climb into them. Their hands were numb. Their clothes were heavy, waterlogged weights dragging them down. The rafts were slippery, covered in oil and slime. It was a battle for inches, fought in the dark, in waves that were tossing the rafts like toys. At 1:45 a.m. the end began. The stern of the Estonia, the back of the ship, began to sink first. The air pockets in the bow were holding the front up. The ship began to tilt longitudinally, the nose rising toward the sky. It was a slow, majestic, terrifying movement. The massive bulbous bow, the visor missing, rose out of the water. The bridge, where the captain and the officers had stayed until the end, slipped beneath the surface. The radar mast disappeared. The funnel disappeared. Finally, only the bow was visible, pointing vertically at the stars, a white tombstone marking the spot. And then, with a rush of bubbles and a deep low rumble that was felt more than heard, the Estonia slipped under. She did not go quietly. As she descended, the pressure crushed the windows, the bulkheads, the remaining air pockets. The ocean reclaimed the space that had been carved out by the engineers. At 1:50 a.m., the surface of the Baltic was empty. The ship was gone. 35 minutes. That is all it took. From the first sharp list to the final disappearance. 35 minutes for a floating city to vanish. On the surface, a terrible silence descended. The wind still howled, but the mechanical noise was gone. In its place was the sound of human voices, calling out names, calling for help, screaming in the dark. And the lights. In the distance, the lights of the other ferries were approaching. The Mariella, the Silja Europa. They were giants, just like the Estonia. They had heard the mayday, they had turned their helms and pushed their engines to the red line. But a ship is not an ambulance. It cannot stop on a dime. It cannot easily pick people out of the water. When the Mariella arrived, the captain looked down from his bridge. He saw the field of debris. He saw the tiny blinking lights of the life jackets, a constellation of tragedy floating in the black water. But he was helpless. The waves were too high to launch his own rescue boats. If he lowered them, they would be smashed. He had to maneuver his massive ship, a vessel the size of a building, carefully trying to create a lee, a calm spot in the wind, to let the rafts drift toward him. It was an agonizing process. The passengers on the Mariella stood on the decks, looking down. They threw lifebuoys, they threw ropes. They watched as people in the water tried to grab them, their hands frozen into claws, only to slip away as the waves surged. The rescue helicopters began to arrive. The Swedish and Finnish winchmen, suspended on thin wires, descended into the hell. They were heroes. They dropped into the freezing spray, grabbing survivors one by one, hauling them up into the noise and safety of the cabin. But they were fighting the clock. Hypothermia is a quiet killer. It starts with shivering. Then the shivering stops. The mind becomes cloudy. You feel warm. You feel sleepy. You stop fighting. Many of those who had survived the sinking, who had fought their way out of the cabins, who had jumped into the sea, who had climbed into rafts, died waiting for the helicopter. They died of the cold, sitting in a raft, safe from the drowning but exposed to the air. The night wore on. The pilots flew until they were exhausted. The winches lifted body after body. And then the sun began to rise. Dawn on the Baltic is usually a grey, muted affair. But on the morning of September 28, 1994, the light revealed the scale of the loss. The sea was empty of the ship, but full of its legacy. Empty rafts drifted in the swell. Life jackets bobbed in the foam, some with people in them, some without. The rescue ships stayed, they kept searching. But as the hours passed, the radio reports changed. The numbers of survivors recovered slowed down. The numbers of bodies recovered began to rise. Of the 989 people who boarded the MS Estonia, only 137 were pulled from the water alive. 852 people were gone. Most of them never left the ship. They were still inside, trapped in the stairwells, in the cabins, in the bars. They were settling into the mud of the sea floor 80 meters down. The crisis was over. The adrenaline had faded. The noise had stopped. Now, the world had to deal with the silence of the dead, the silence of the families waiting in the terminals in Stockholm and Tallinn, and the silence of the governments who had promised that this kind of thing could not happen. The ship was on the bottom, but the questions were just beginning to float to the surface, and unlike the survivors, the questions would not freeze. They would burn. The morning after the storm, the terminals in Stockholm were quiet. There were barriers set up, and crowds of people standing behind them. They were waiting for a ship that was not on the horizon. They were waiting for faces they would never see again. There is a specific kind of silence that fills a room when a tragedy is confirmed. It is heavy. It sucks the air out of the lungs. As the hours passed and the lists of survivors were posted, the silence turned into a sound, the sound of weeping, a collective, hollow noise of realization. 852. That is the number. It is not just a statistic. It is a village. It is a school, a factory, a neighborhood. 852 lives extinguished in the cold mud of the Baltic. But the horror of the Estonia disaster did not end with the drowning. It continued with the waiting. In most disasters, there is a funeral. There is a body to wash, to dress, to lower into the earth. There is a place to visit. For the families of the Estonia victims, there was only the sea. Most of the bodies, over 700 of them, were never recovered. They remained inside the hull. They were trapped in the cabins where they slept, in the stairwells where they fell, in the duty-free shops where they had laughed. The ship became their coffin, a steel ossuary resting at a list of 120 degrees in the eternal dark. And immediately the questions began. Why? How? 3 nations, Estonia, Sweden and Finland, formed a joint accident investigation commission, the JAIC. It was a bureaucratic entity charged with dissecting a nightmare. They sent divers down, they sent robots. They recovered the bow visor, which had been found lying on the seabed, a mile away from the wreck. It was the smoking gun. The 55-ton shield was battered, its hinges torn, its bolts sheared. The official report, when it was finally released years later, was thick with technical diagrams and metallurgical analysis. It pointed the finger at the locks. It pointed the finger at the design. It pointed the finger at the speed. It was a clean answer, a mechanical answer. The visor fell off, the ramp opened, the water got in, the ship sank. Case closed. But for the families and for the maritime world, it felt too simple. It felt like a cover for a deeper systemic rot. It didn't explain the speed of the sinking. It didn't explain the lack of evacuation. It didn't explain why a ship certified as safe could fall apart in a storm that was severe, but not unprecedented. The official answer provided a culprit, the visor, but it did not provide peace. It felt like the authorities were eager to close the book, to seal the file, to move on. Stability, after all, is the priority of governments, just as it is the priority of ships. This desire for stability led to one of the most controversial decisions in maritime history. The wreck of the Estonia lies in shallow water. It is reachable. Technology exists to salvage it, or at least to recover the bodies. The families begged for their loved ones to be brought home. They wanted to bury their dead. But the Swedish government said no. They cited the danger to divers. They cited the trauma of disturbing the site. They cited the cost. Instead, they proposed something ancient and disturbing. They proposed to cover the ship in concrete. Imagine the image. Barges loaded with thousands of tons of gravel and cement, floating over the gravesite, pouring a grey, suffocating blanket over the white hull. They wanted to turn the ship into a sarcophagus, to bury the evidence and the people under a man-made mountain on the floor of the sea. They actually began the work. They dumped thousands of tons of rocks around the wreck, but the outcry was too great. The families were horrified. The plan was halted. Instead, they turned to the law. They created the Estonia Agreement. They declared the site a sanctuary. They made it illegal for citizens of the signatory nations to dive there. They surrounded the dead with a ring of legislation. The wreck was not to be touched. It was to be left to the rust and the silt. It was a decision that bred suspicion. When you forbid people from looking at a crime scene, they start to wonder what you are hiding. To this day, the shadow of a cover-up hangs over the Baltic, fueled by the government's desperate need to keep the water undisturbed. But while the dead were left in the dark, the living were forced to change. The legacy of the Estonia is written in the rule books of every ferry that sails today. It is a legacy paid for in blood. Before 1994, the safety regulations for ro-ro ferries were a patchwork of old assumptions. After the Estonia, the International Maritime Organization had to rewrite the Bible of safety, the SOLAS Convention. Safety of life at sea. They looked at the free surface effect, that deadly sloshing of water on the car deck. They realized that the open deck was a death trap, so they mandated change. Existing ships had to be retrofitted. They had to install flood-control doors on the car deck, barriers that would divide the massive garage into smaller sections, stopping the water from rushing the length of the ship. They demanded sponsons. These are distinct bulges welded to the sides of the hull, like permanent life preservers made of steel. They make the ship wider. They increase stability. They ensure that even if water gets in, the ship will not flip over instantly. It cost the industry billions. It made the ships uglier, wider, slower. But it worked. Today, if you drive your car onto a ferry in Dover or Helsinki, you are driving onto a safer machine. You are driving onto a ship that remembers the Estonia. But memory fades. Steel rusts, but memory rusts faster. Look at the sea today. The ships we build now make the Estonia look like a toy. We have cruise ships that carry 6,000 passengers. They are 18 decks high. They have parks with real trees, ice rinks, theaters, and robotic bartenders. They are marvels of engineering. They are automated to a degree that was science fiction in the 90s. The captain does not steer with a wheel. He steers with a joystick. The computer monitors the stability thousands of times a second. But the philosophy remains the same. The ambition is the same. We are still building floating cities. We are still trying to bring the comfort of the land onto the hostility of the water. We trust these machines implicitly. When we step aboard, we do not look for the lifeboats. We look for the buffet. We do not check the weather report. We check the Wi-Fi signal. We have convinced ourselves once again that we have solved the problem. We tell ourselves that the Estonia was a relic of a sloppy era, a mistake of the post-Soviet transition. We tell ourselves that our technology is infallible. But the North Atlantic does not care about our technology. The physics of water have not changed since the beginning of time. It is still heavy, it is still cold, and it is still waiting for a crack in the armor. The Estonia serves as a grim marker in the timeline of human progress. She sits there, 80 meters down, slowly collapsing under the weight of the sea and the weight of the rocks dumped upon her. The white paint has peeled away. The steel is being eaten by bacteria. The names of the dead are dissolving into the silt. But she is still speaking to us. She tells us that efficiency is not the same as safety. She tells us that a schedule is not a law of physics. She tells us that no matter how big the machine, it is small compared to the ocean. We walk through the doors of these ships every day. We trust the invisible welds, the hydraulic seals, the blinking green lights on the bridge. We trust the system, and usually the system works. Usually the door stays closed, usually we arrive. But the legacy of the Estonia is the knowledge that usually is not always. The disaster was not caused by a storm, a mistake, or a single piece of metal. It was caused by confidence unchallenged, systems optimized for speed, and a belief that disaster always announces itself in advance. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through a door designed to open.